Hey everybody, believe it or not, 2022 is already drawing to a close, which means it's time for my annual Top Reads video. I get asked for book recommendations all the time. People want lists of what I've been reading, what I've latched on to, what have been the most interesting books that I've read throughout the year. And so now, as is tradition, we'll be going ahead and looking at the top 9 books that I read this year, what I thought about them, and why I think they might be interesting for you. Number 1, Society and the Mind, Vilfredo Pareto. So Vilfredo Pareto is one of the key figures in the school of political theory that is called Italian elite theory. It's the school of political theory that is also kind of the root, the basis of neo-reactionary political theory. Pareto was featured heavily in James Burnham's very influential book, The Machiavellians. And so I think it's pretty safe to say that if you want to understand these different strands of political thought, Pareto is a key figure, and Society and the Mind is the work that generally contains a lot of these insights. Now, I do want to go ahead and warn you at the outset that Pareto is a very challenging read for a lot of reasons. First, Society and the Mind is spread over 4 huge volumes. I think it's over 2,000 pages. And so I highly recommend, if you are interested in reading this, picking up the abridged version, which is retitled A Compendium of General Sociology. This more condensed version still weighs in at over 500 pages, but it was approved by the author, and it does have most of the key insights that you really are looking for here. The other exciting thing about Pareto is that he tends to write in formal logic. He just kind of drops these equations into his work as he's going. So that can be pretty daunting for a lot of people. Again, if you want to grasp some of those key insights, just picking up The Machiavellians by James Burnham and reading the chapters on Pareto will give you many of the most important takeaways. But I don't want to warn you off reading this volume. It is actually very insightful. There's a lot of things that Burnham can't cover in just the few pages that he dedicates to Pareto. And so if you really do want to dig in here, there's a lot of rewarding stuff. I just want to give you that warning, that heads up at the very beginning, that this is not some breezy beach read. If you pick this up, you're really dedicating yourself to some serious scholarship here. So just make sure you understand that before you go all in. This can also be a difficult volume to acquire. They finally did a reprint here recently. You can find it on Amazon, but it is not cheap at all. You can also get it through interlibrary loan, which is something I would suggest if you're looking to save the money. It might take you a week or so to get it in, but it does make it far more affordable to go ahead and get a hold of an otherwise difficult to acquire volume. Okay, so all that said, why are we reading this? Why does it matter? Why is it worth the effort? So the thing about Pareto is that his sociological system is very interesting. It's very different. He has an approach that strips away the narratives of causality. He takes an approach that really, instead of looking about what people say about their actions and their actual rhetoric around and justification for their ideologies, instead he looks at what they do. He looks at their actual functions and actions in society, and from that, he then draws his conclusions on why these things exist in society, why society is set up this way, why these forces act internally in any given civilization. He really sees ideology as a post hoc rationalization for why people take the actions that they do, and that leads him to some very interesting conclusions that inform a lot of this Machiavellian analysis, this Italian elite theory of power. So for Pareto, the driving social forces in society kind of come from what he calls residues. These are kind of personality types, or again, social forces that are recurring in every society. They might develop differently, they might manifest slightly differently in any given culture, but they are always present. They're always a force inside any given society. And so he sees these as kind of the motivating factors. It doesn't really matter what the ideology is. is that's layered on top of the action of these residues. The residues are the actual recurring cause of these forces. He also sees these different derivations on these residues that can cause different outcomes. Again, it's a lot to get into, but for our purposes, the key ones, the ones that we're going to focus on a lot, are the ones you've heard me talk about before. They're the type 1 and the type 2 derivations, the ones that Machiavelli would have described as the foxes and the lions. And so a good chunk of Italian elite theory and neo-reactionary theory come from Pareto's analysis of the interaction between these two residues. Also, this is where he gets into things like the circulation of elites and what it takes for that kind of process to occur. Again, there's just way too much to go over here, but like I said, this is a foundational text. It's very complicated, it's very long, it can be challenging to get a hold of and read, but if you really want to understand this stuff and you want the primary sources about it, then this is certainly a volume that's going to be worth your time. Number 2, The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt. So I'm obviously pretty late to the game on this book. I've heard of Haidt's work many times. In fact, I've heard him speak many times all over the place, podcasts, discussions, debates, all this stuff. But I had never actually got around to reading The Righteous Mind. So I was familiar with the concept in theory, but I hadn't actually gone in depth with what he had written on the subject. So for those who are unfamiliar, kind of the key point of The Righteous Mind is that, again, people really tend to have a post hoc rationalization for moral opinions that they formed before they even really had the facts around or logic around any given issue. Basically, we all have different moral taste buds, a moral palate, which we apply to any given issue, and it is the key determiner of our approach or understanding when it comes to the morality of any given topic. Haidt is constantly using this idea of the elephant and the rider. Your moral palate is the elephant. It's what's actually leading your actions. And the rider is your logic on top of the elephant, which is kind of providing moral justification, pretending that it's what drove your decision, when in actuality, it's the elephant who's kind of going wherever it wants. And the logic, the rider, is just kind of trying to look important in the middle of this whole thing. Now, it was very interesting to have, by coincidence, read this book right after reading Pareto, who makes very similar assertions about motivations and post hoc rationalizations of people, kind of the ideological explanation after the fact to justify positions that were already going to be taken, that were already kind of determined by other innate factors. I would be very interested to know if Jonathan Haidt had any level of familiarity with Vilfredo Pareto, or if they both kind of came to this conclusion from two different angles separately. Either way, it's not a one-to-one. There are very different explanations and motivations involved in both of these books, so you can't just say that they're both describing exactly the same thing, but it is a very interesting overlap nonetheless. One thing that I also found interesting about Haidt's book is kind of his conclusions at the end. He goes on and on for many different pages explaining why different people from different backgrounds are kind of destined to have particular moral opinions and how they can't really see morality any other way. It's a post hoc rationalization for a decision that's already made before they even encounter the issue. But then his conclusion at the end is just kind of this general liberal approach of, well, now that we better understand why people come to these moral conclusions, hopefully it will give us more tolerance when we're discussing these issues and trying to come to some kind of general moral consensus, even though pretty much everything he talked about for all of the preceding pages kind of explains why people aren't able to see from each other's viewpoints and why a moral consensus is really unlikely to be reached from these different parties. But I guess given his priors, he kind of has to wrap it up in this style, so I'm not going to hold that much against him. In general, the book is pretty well thought out, very illuminating. And like I said, if you are exploring the works of people like Pareto, this does happen to dovetail pretty well. Again, it takes a very similar approach to the idea of how humans gain their opinions and why they take the actions that they do. So make sure to check it out. Number 3, Discourses on Livy, Niccolo Machiavelli. When it comes to reading Machiavelli, The Prince is the place that most people start and also the place that most people end, and that's totally understandable. The Prince has a lot of Machiavelli's most important ideas. It's a very short work, very easy to read. It has a lot of his most famous quotes in it. Totally understandable. But if you really want to get a far deeper perspective on the way that Machiavelli thought about politics, you really can't do any better than Discourses on Livy. It is, to be fair, a more difficult read, not because the words are more difficult, the passages are more difficult or significantly more complex than The Prince, but because the way it is structured, the way Machiavelli structures this, is he pulls different historical vignettes out of Livy, and he then provides commentary around those historical events that illuminate different aspects of politics and military leadership, statesmanship, those kind of things. So this means if you want to get everything out of what Machiavelli is saying, you have to have a pretty decent understanding of Roman history. I mean, it doesn't need to be encyclopedic, you don't have to be an expert, but if you're completely unfamiliar with Roman history, then a lot of this might not make sense to you. I mean, you can still pull some of the insights, some of the nuggets out of there, but you really will be missing some pretty important context. So you kind of need to do some research. You kind of have to have a certain level of backstory filled in for you before all of this will kind of make a lot of sense. That said, if the historical knowledge isn't a barrier for you, this is very much worth a read. Machiavelli gets far more in depth on his advice when it comes to politics. He lays out some lessons that I think still ring very true many centuries later, and interestingly, he also gets into his preference for a republican form of government, something that might surprise many people. It, of course, isn't perfect. Some of this is dated, some of it is just flat out wrong, but it's all very interesting and it fleshes out your understanding again of Machiavelli's theories surrounding politics and statecraft. And each lesson is wrapped around a particular historical event that provides context and a specific illustration, which I think is very helpful. Number 4, Leviathan and Its Enemies, Samuel T. Francis. There is no book that I spent more time with in 2022 than Leviathan and Its Enemies. Again, just to get out of the way, Leviathan and Its Enemies is a sprawling tome. It's over like 700 pages, and I believe it was published after Francis's death. It didn't have a proper editing process, and unfortunately, you can tell this book probably could have been trimmed by at least 100, maybe 150 pages. There's a decent amount of repetition here. It really would have appreciated a good editor, but that said, the book is still just a masterpiece of political theory. James Burnham's Managerial Revolution was one of the most important books about politics written in the last, 100 some odd years, but it was certainly dated. It was certainly incomplete. It was desperate for someone to kind of pick it up, dust it off, bring it into the modern day, and apply its lessons to the world around us. And that's exactly what Leviathan and Its Enemies does. It delves deeply into Burnham's theory and it updates it for a more modern audience. It corrects many of the mistakes that Burnham made, updates many of the shortcomings, and also gives us a very interesting explanation as to why this process went the way that it did in the years between the original publication of Burnham's book and then, of course, Leviathan and Its Enemies. Francis does a really good job of looking at kind of classic capitalism, the thing that we think of as the economic and social engine of the United States, and he talks about how it transitions into this more managerial capitalism, why that looked different in America than it did in other countries. And he also does a really good job of explaining why kind of progressive radicals originally viewed managerialism as an enemy, but why today it is treated more as an ally. He explains that process, why that initial tension took place, and why it's resolving itself in the way it is now in our current day. Francis also does an excellent job of explaining the incentives of the managers, why they tend to transform organizations the way they do, why their solutions are required to kind of be the way they are, why they require the breakdown of tradition, the breakdown of identity, and why they ultimately lead to globalization, why we're creating a global managerial class kind of at the end of this process. Like I said, this is a really excellent book. It explains our times very well, and this belongs in any kind of Italian elite theory canon or neo-reactionary canon, whatever you want to call this body of thought. Leviathan and Its Enemies is absolutely an essential part of it. It's probably the most important update on that theory until you get to Curtis Yarvin, and I really highly recommend it. Number 5, Blood Meridian, Cormac McCarthy. The first Cormac McCarthy book I read was The Road. I had seen the movie like a lot of people, but I had never really gotten deeply into Cormac McCarthy. I'd heard his name many times, highly recommended, but I'd never just gotten around to reading any of his stuff, and I really enjoyed The Road, so I definitely wanted to make an effort to read more of his stuff this year. And of course, if you talk to people about this author, the one thing you hear every time is Blood Meridian. Man, you've got to read Blood Meridian. So good. It's the real American novel. You know, it's the true American novel in every sense of the word. And so with that kind of high recommendation, you usually expect, okay, this is very hyped up. There's going to be some level of disappointment. It's not going to live up to this. But I got to say, in a lot of ways, this one did. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was very interesting. It took me a while to get fully invested, but once I was in, I was completely hooked. It's a very unique novel. McCarthy's style is famously very sparse and harsh, which of course is really great for this kind of story, this harsh, rough, untamed story of the West, revealing a lot of very dark and sinister things about human nature, presenting a very isolating experience in certain areas when the characters are battling through the difficulty of nature, that very harsh and untamed environment that is a key part of the West, and then also very graphic battle scenes when they happen, but again, just kind of the economic use of language. It's very captivating. It paints a very interesting picture, very appropriate for this setting. And of course, the judge, I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but this character is just monstrous in a very interesting, very compelling way. It's a very unique character that you'll always remember when you think back to this book. So just a lot to recommend this. Again, one of those novels that I had hyped up for me many different times, and I was very pleasantly surprised to find out that it did live up to the hype. Number 6, Generative Principles of Political Constitutions, Joseph de Maistre. Joseph de Maistre is one of my favorite political thinkers, and I've recommended some of his other works to you in the past. I think in some ways de Maistre gets passed over because a lot of the stuff that he elucidates weirdly also got wrapped up into Carl Schmitt, and because Schmitt is very concise and much more modern, a lot of people kind of go directly to Schmitt and they forget about de Maistre, but I really think he's essential reading. Now, Generative Principles of Political Constitutions is really more of an extended essay than it is a book in its own right, and you can usually pick it up as part of a collection with some of his other works. You can also usually find it free on the internet, but if you're looking for a physical copy, Imperium Press has a great collection. You can go ahead and check it out in there. So one of the interesting things about de Maistre in this essay is that, as you can imagine from the title, he's discussing where political constitutions come from, why they get written, how they get written, what the origins of their contents are. And he brings up something that I think should be pretty obvious, but we seem to have forgotten over the years. See, in America, we have this idea that, well, the first thing you do is you codify the principles of your country into a written constitution constitution, and then from there the country kind of shapes itself around it. Our order of operations is that you put these separation of powers and these rights and all of these things that are built into the constitution first, and then the government's required to follow it, and the character of the people and the government kind of emerge around this written document. But de Maistre says actually this is exactly the opposite way the process works. What he says is that political constitutions are really just the codification of values that already exist organically inside a society. De Maistre asserts that all constitutions are theological in their nature and their origins, which is something that is kind of harsh on modern ears, but is something that is echoed in the works of someone like Carl Schmitt. De Maistre says that it is the character of the people which is imbued in them by God that will determine the nature of their governments and will therefore determine the type of constitution that they generate. He makes it clear that the written articles of a constitution are not what give it its strength. In fact, he says the strength of a constitution is inversely proportionate to its number of written articles, and that instead it is the willingness of the people to perpetuate their values and protect their values and their culture that actually gives a constitution its strength. It's not the written words on paper, but it is the nature and the culture and the tradition of the people that they carry forward which actually gives a constitution its value. I can and have gone on ad nauseum about this subject elsewhere, so I'm not going to belabor the point here. Make sure you read this. It's short, it's relatively easy to understand. You can probably grab it online if you want. Make sure to check it out. Number 7, Man and Technique, Oswald Spengler. Oswald Spengler is somebody who has had a profound impact on my thinking. I really can't recommend his stuff highly enough, but his key work, Decline of the West, is massive. It's very intimidating. It's 1,000+ pages over 2 volumes, so I don't blame anybody from shying away from it. If you're looking for something that will allow you to get a taste of Spengler's thinking without making that big 1,000-page commitment, Man and Technique is kind of the way for you to go. Man and Technique is really a pamphlet. It's like 70-something pages, but again, it gives you a taste of that thought process that you're going to see when you read Spengler's larger work. This pamphlet centers around the idea that man generates these techniques that in many ways separate him from nature and set him along a certain path. This line of thinking leads Spengler to make some very interesting and accurate predictions about the way that men in post-industrial revolution societies will eventually arrive at a rationalist and materialistic version of religion. He also talks in a very interesting way about how the creation of machines and complex mechanisms don't in the end save human beings' labor, but instead transform the nature of their labor from one of kind of subsistence, one making it to the next day, feeding themselves, and instead warps their labor around the continuation, the perpetuation, the maintenance of these complex machines that they have created. The day-to-day lives of the average human will become more and more artificial because more and more of their labor and their time is wrapped around the maintenance and continuation of these increasingly abstract systems. He also, in a very interesting way, predicts globalization because he says as these abstract societies become more and more complex, there will really become only 2 types of nations. There'll be those that are capable of building these complex machines, these intricate systems, and those that will necessarily be pulled under their sway because those nations cannot themselves produce those things, but they do provide labor and resources for that. So he says you will have these nations that swallow up all the other ones as they expand the reach and they try to increase the complexity of the systems that they're building. Again, the whole thing is not very long. He doesn't completely answer every question because it's really a short pamphlet more than anything else. But again, if you want something that's going to whet your appetite and give you a sample of what you'll get if you make that deep dive into something like Decline of the West, this is a great place to start. Number 8, Lives, Plutarch. There's not a whole lot to say here. Plutarch's Lives is a classic work. It takes these different bite-sized biographies of great men throughout both Greek and Roman history, talks about their great deeds, talks about lessons you can learn from them, including, of course, their tragic mistakes. You can get different mixes of these. Sometimes you can get the complete Greek lives, or you can get the complete Roman lives. Some collections will have the entirety of them. Some of them will only have certain selections. There's many different ways you can go from this, and this is the kind of thing that you can pick up at like a used bookstore. You'll find like one of these Harvard Condensed Classic editions that you can pick up on the cheap. And like I said, because these things are very small and consumable, each one of these chapters is, maybe 20 or 30 pages. It makes it the perfect thing to be able to pick up and put down and, just go where you left off and not have to worry about remembering the storyline or, all the big ideas or something like that. Makes it very easy for you to kind of brush up on your history in small chunks. So if you're trying to work up to having the historical background necessary to read something like Discourses on Livy, this isn't a bad place to start. Number 9, No Country for Old Men, Cormac McCarthy. Yes, this is my second entry from McCarthy on the list, but like I said, I really enjoyed The Road, and I wanted to dedicate myself to reading more of the guy's back catalog. I know this one isn't going to be any kind of hidden gem or groundbreaking recommendation. It was made into a major award-winning movie by giant Hollywood directors. But if it helps, I still actually haven't seen the movie, which is weird because, again, I do like Cormac McCarthy and I like the Coen brothers, so you think I would have gotten around to seeing this one, but it just never happened. I'll certainly have to do that now, I guess. This book is a little more accessible. It's more contemporary, set closer to our current time, and it also isn't quite as brutal. It's still brutal, but I don't know how to say this properly. It's more filled in. It's not as sparse. The storyline is not quite as alien, and so I think it's something that's a little more approachable for people who haven't read anything from McCarthy yet. Which is why something like this probably got turned into a movie way before something like Blood Meridian. So it's not exactly bubblegum, but it is a little closer to a beach read than some of McCarthy's other stuff. I enjoyed it, and I think it's a good place to start if you're somebody who enjoys westerns in general, but maybe needs something a little more modern and a little more accessible. Well, thanks for watching, guys. This has been my top 9 reads for 2022. Let me know what you think about these picks down below in the comments, and if you guys have any suggestions, any great books that you've read throughout the year, make sure to tell me down there as well. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you click like, and I've got all my previous reading recommendations in a playlist which you can check out. Also, if this is your first time at the channel, make sure you click subscribe. As many of you know, I've recently joined the Blaze here, and I really appreciate all your support and congratulations. It's been kind of overwhelming. A lot of my stuff is going to be appearing on their different outlets. I'm already writing articles there, so you can check out theblaze.com for that, and you're going to see me show up on all the different podcast platforms like Apple and Google Play and Spotify, all that stuff. I'll make sure to share all the links with you guys as that stuff gets set up, so you'll be able to listen to the show on all kinds of different places. And as usual, I've got all my links below for things like Twitter and Gab and Odyssey and Rumble, so you can follow me on all those different channels as well. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.